The sun rose over the small city of Brookdale, painting the police training field in soft shades of gold. Officers lined up in their usual morning drill, but all eyes kept glancing toward one special figure, a large, proud German shepherd named Sergeant Max. His coat shone under the light, and his sharp amber eyes scanned every movement. For years, Max had been the pride of the K-9 unit, a legend in his own right. Whenever there was danger, a bomb threat, a missing child, or a chase through the woods, Max was the first one called in. Beside him stood Officer Jack Daniels, his handler and best friend. Jack had trained Max since he was just a small puppy with oversized paws and endless curiosity. Together, they had built a bond that no words could describe, one built on loyalty, bravery, and trust. When Max barked once, Jack understood. When Jack pointed, Max ran without hesitation. They were a perfect team, the kind every officer dreamed of having. For 5 long years, Max served on the front lines. He tracked suspects through dark alleys, sniffed out drugs and explosives hidden in trucks, and once even saved a group of school children by detecting a bomb under a bridge. News stations ran his story. People called him the hero dog of Brookdale. He wore his badge proudly, not because he understood fame, but because it meant he had a purpose. But one morning changed everything. It was supposed to be a routine raid on an abandoned warehouse on the city's edge. The intelligence team had received reports about a gang hiding illegal weapons there. Jack, Max, and 3 other officers were sent in. As usual, Max led the way, sniffing along the dusty floor and signaling danger with a sharp bark. Jack gave a hand signal, "Move in quietly." The air was tense, filled with dust, sweat, and the faint metallic smell of gun oil. They found the first stash of weapons near the back wall. But as Jack reached for his radio, Max suddenly froze. His body stiffened, ears pointing straight ahead. Before Jack could react, Max lunged forward, pushing Jack down, just as a deafening explosion tore through the air. The world went white. When the smoke cleared, the warehouse was in ruins. Jack's uniform was covered in dust, his ears ringing. He called out, "Max, Max," and his heart sank when he saw his partner lying near a pile of bricks, crying softly. His right hind leg was bent at an unnatural angle, bleeding badly. Despite the pain, Max tried to crawl toward Jack, as if to make sure he was okay. Jack dropped to his knees, tears running down his face, and cradled Max's head in his arms. "You saved my life, buddy," he whispered, trembling. Max was rushed to the vet hospital in a police van, sirens wailing. For hours, the surgical team fought to save his leg. They managed to stop the bleeding, but the damage was too severe. The bones were shattered beyond repair. Max would live, but he would never run again, never chase again, never serve again. When Jack heard the news, he stood in silence. The chief placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "He's done his duty, Daniels. He's a hero." Max was awarded a medal for bravery, but he didn't understand the applause or the flashing cameras. All he knew was that he could no longer stand the way he used to. His once strong leg trembled every time he tried to walk. The pain wasn't just in his body, it was in his spirit. Weeks later, Jack received a sudden transfer to another city. The new department had no space for Max, and the rules were clear. Retired police dogs had to be released or auctioned. Jack begged to take Max with him, but regulations blocked his request. "He's government property," the chief said apologetically. "The paperwork doesn't allow private adoption outside the district." The day Jack said goodbye was one of the hardest days of his life. He sat beside Max's kennel, holding his paw. "I'm sorry, partner. You deserved better." Max whimpered and pressed his nose into Jack's hand, not understanding why his friend was walking away. When Jack finally left, Max stayed by the gate for hours, waiting, but Jack never came back. Days turned into weeks. Max's world grew smaller, just the narrow walls of the police shelter and the cold floor beneath him. He no longer barked or wagged his tail when someone walked by. The officers who once cheered for him now passed without a glance. New, younger dogs were being trained outside. Strong, fast, full of life. Max watched from the window, his eyes empty, but his heart still loyal to a duty he could no longer fulfill, when the announcement came for a public auction of retired canine dogs. Max's name was last on the list. The event was held in a small open yard behind the police station. People gathered, some looking for guard dogs, some for pets, others just curious. Max sat quietly in his cage, his once glorious fur now dull, a small scar visible on his leg. The auctioneer read his details aloud. Sergeant Max, 7 years old, retired service dog, injury on right hind leg. People glanced at him, but quickly turned away. He looked stolid. One man muttered, "Can't even run," said another. A woman whispered, "Poor thing, but I can't take care of a crippled dog." Max watched them all pass by. His ears lowered, his tail still. He didn't bark, didn't move. For the first time in his life, there was no command to follow, no partner to protect, just silence. The auctioneer's voice echoed, "Any bids?" Starting at $100. No one raised a hand. He tried again, lowering the price, but the crowd had already lost interest. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard. The air grew heavy with the sound of papers rustling and distant chatter. Max lowered his head onto his paws, closing his eyes as if surrendering to the inevitable, to be forgotten, discarded like broken equipment after years of service. He didn't know that someone was watching him quietly from the back of the crowd, a man in a faded gray jacket, hands in his pockets, eyes filled with something different. Not pity, but recognition. For now, though, Max remained alone, a hero once celebrated, now unseen, sitting behind cold iron bars, unaware that his life was about to change forever. The crowd at the police auction began to thin out as the afternoon sun dipped lower, stretching golden rays across the dusty courtyard. The air felt heavy, tired, filled with the murmurs of people discussing the dogs they had already bought. Most of the cages were empty now, their new owners walking away proudly with their animals, while the remaining few cages were ignored completely. Max's was one of them. The once celebrated K9 hero lay quietly on the floor of his crate, his eyes following the movement of people's shoes as they walked past him without care. He had stopped hoping for someone to stop, someone to notice him. To Max, the world outside the metal bars was a blur of colors and voices that no longer mattered. The auctioneer's voice cracked slightly from exhaustion as he looked down at the final sheet on his clipboard. Next up, Sergeant Max. Retired police dog, age 7, trained in detection and protection, sustained leg injury during service. He read out, his tone dry, as if repeating the same announcement for the 100th time that day. He paused, looked around the yard, and added, "Opening bid, $100. His voice carried over the quiet space, but nobody responded. A few heads turned, some out of curiosity, others out of mild pity, but soon turned back to their conversations. The auctioneer tried again, $75, still nothing. Max lifted his head slightly, his eyes, once sharp and commanding, now held a dull glow, as though he had accepted his fate. He didn't whine or bark, he just waited, tired and unmoving. The officers nearby avoided looking at him directly. They respected him once, they admired his courage, but now he was a painful reminder of how quickly heroes are forgotten. A few of them whispered quietly to each other, things like "poor old boy" or "no one's going to take a crippled dog." Just then, from the far end of the yard, a faint sound of footsteps approached. They were steady, slow, deliberate. The auctioneer, frustrated and ready to close the session, was about to declare the dog unsold when he noticed a man walking toward them. The man was tall but not imposing, dressed simply in worn jeans, a faded gray jacket, and a pair of work boots covered with dust. He looked like someone who spent more time outdoors than among people. His hair was streaked with gray at the edges, and though he looked calm, his eyes carried something deep. A mixture of sadness and quiet strength. He stopped near Max's cage, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, studying the dog silently. There was no pity in his gaze, only understanding. For a long moment, neither man nor dog moved. Then Max slowly lifted his head, and their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them, something invisible yet powerful. It was as if both souls recognized each other's scars, one on the outside, one deep within. The auctioneer cleared his throat impatiently. "Sir, would you like to place a bid?" The man nodded once, without a word. "Starting bid is $75, the auctioneer continued. The man's quiet voice finally broke the silence. "75, he said simply. There was no enthusiasm, no show, just a calm statement. The auctioneer looked around, waiting for a counterbid. None came. People exchanged glances but remained silent. No one wanted to compete for a broken dog. After a few seconds, the auctioneer raised his hand. "Sold to Mr.?" he asked, waiting for the man's name. "Henry Cole," the man replied, and with that, the gavel came down with a dull thud. A few officers looked at each other, surprised. Henry Cole was not a familiar name around the department. He wasn't a breeder or trainer, not a police supporter they knew. He was just a quiet stranger. As the paperwork was signed, one of the younger officers leaned toward another and whispered, "Who spends $75 on a crippled police dog?" The other shrugged. Maybe he just felt sorry for it. Henry overheard them, but his expression didn't change. When the auction ended, Henry walked toward Max's cage. The officer on duty opened the latch hesitantly, expecting the dog to resist or bark. But Max didn't move. He watched Henry carefully, uncertain. Henry knelt down in front of him, moving slowly, giving the dog time to study him. His voice came out calm and low, carrying the kind of gentleness that only people who have seen pain can master. "You've done your part, haven't you?" he said softly. "Time to rest now." Something in Henry's tone made Max's ears twitch. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling behind them. When Henry extended his hand through the bars, Max hesitated only for a moment, before pressing his nose gently against his palm. The contact was small, almost hesitant, but it carried more weight than any applause or medal Max had ever received. It was the beginning of trust. The officers around them watched in silence as Henry clipped the leash onto Max's collar and helped him out of the cage. Max's limp was noticeable, his gait uneven, but he followed Henry without resistance. They walked across the yard together. One man, one dog, both shadows of what they once were. As they passed the auctioneer's table, Henry signed the last paper and thanked him with a nod. Then he turned to the dog and said, "Come on, partner, let's go home." The word home echoed in Max's mind like a distant memory. He hadn't heard it in so long that it almost felt like a dream. The officers stood watching as the pair walked toward a beat-up old truck parked under a tree. Henry opened the door and waited. Max paused for a second, looked up at the man, and then, with some effort, climbed in. Henry smiled faintly, scratched behind his ear, and closed the door. The engine started with a low growl, and as the truck pulled away from the police yard, the setting sun glinted off its windshield. Inside, Max lay on a soft blanket Henry had placed on the seat. The breeze through the half-open window carried the scent of grass, wood, and something peaceful, something far from sirens and gunpowder. For the first time in months, Max's body began to relax. His eyes closed slowly, and as Henry drove down the quiet country road, Max rested his head against the man's arm, trusting him completely. At that moment, neither of them knew that this simple act, one quiet hand raised at an auction, would change both their lives forever. The countryside stretched endlessly in front of them. Golden fields swaying gently in the afternoon breeze as Henry's old pickup truck rumbled down the narrow road. The sun was warm, the air was thick with the scent of grass and earth, and the world seemed so different from the cold concrete yards Max had grown used to. Inside the truck, Max lay quietly on the seat beside Henry, his head resting against a folded blanket. Every few minutes, Henry would glance over at him, studying the deep scar on his hind leg and the way his chest rose and fell with cautious, shallow breaths. There was no barking, no fear, just silence and an odd sense of understanding between two souls who had both been broken by life in their own ways. When they reached Henry's home, the truck rolled to a stop in front of a small wooden cabin nestled near the edge of a wide green meadow. The house wasn't fancy, it looked old, hand-built, with ivy crawling up its porch railings and a rocking chair that creaked with every touch of wind, but it felt peaceful. There were no walls of noise, no echoing sirens, no shouting voices, only the sound of birds and the distant hum of the river that ran behind the property. Henry turned off the engine and looked at Max. "Well, partner, this is it," he said gently. "Home." The word hung in the air like sunlight. Max lifted his head slowly, his ears twitching at the sound of Henry's calm voice. Henry opened the door, came around to Max's side, and unlatched the leash. "Take your time," he whispered. "No rush." Max hesitated for a moment before stepping down. His injured leg trembled slightly, and he stumbled, but Henry was there instantly, his hand steadying him. Together, they walked up the short path to the porch, Henry matching his steps to Max's slow pace. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine wood and old coffee. The floorboards creaked softly underfoot, and sunlight filtered through the windows in golden streaks. Henry had already prepared a small corner with a blanket, a water bowl, and a dish filled with fresh food. "It's not much," Henry murmured, watching Max sniff cautiously around the room, "but it's yours now." Max's tail moved, just once, slow and uncertain, like a memory returning after too long. He lowered his head to the food bowl but didn't eat. Instead, he walked toward the window, lay down quietly, and stared outside at the trees. Over the next few days, Henry gave Max the space he needed. He didn't push him to play or walk. He didn't treat him like a project to fix. Instead, he simply existed beside him. Every morning, Henry brewed his coffee and sat on the porch, sometimes reading the newspaper, sometimes saying nothing at all. Max would limp out from the cabin, lie near Henry's feet, and doze in the morning light. Slowly, a rhythm began to form between them, a quiet companionship built not on words, but on presence. Henry noticed that Max's nightmares were frequent. At night, the dog would jerk awake, whining, his paws twitching as if he were running through fire again. Henry, half asleep, would reach down, stroke his head, and whisper softly, "You're safe now. You're home." It took weeks before Max began to sleep peacefully through the night. As time passed, Henry began introducing little changes to their days. One morning, he walked out to his workshop behind the cabin, a wooden shed filled with the smell of sawdust and varnish, and started cutting small planks of wood. Max followed him, watching curiously from the doorway. Henry smiled and said, "You can watch, but no chewing." "All right." The dog tilted his head slightly, as if trying to understand. Over several days, Henry crafted something unusual, a small ramp made of smooth, sanded planks leading up to the porch steps. It was simple but sturdy. When it was done, he called Max over and said, "Try it." The first time, Max hesitated, but with gentle encouragement, he took a step, then another, until he was standing proudly on the porch again. Henry clapped softly, grinning like a child. "Good boy," he said warmly. "That's what I call progress." From that day on, the ramp became Max's path to freedom. Henry noticed how Max's limp worsened the long periods of walking, so he came up with another idea. Using leather straps, foam padding, and metal joints from his tool cabinet, he began building a makeshift leg brace. It took hours of work and several attempts, but Henry was patient. When he finally fitted the brace gently around Max's injured leg, the dog looked confused, even startled. Henry chuckled softly, scratching behind his ear. "Give it a try, soldier." Max took a few hesitant steps. The brace supported his weight better than he expected, and though his gait was still uneven, he walked farther than before. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, and for Henry, that something meant hope. Every afternoon, they took short walks down the dirt road that led through the meadows. Henry carried a small walking stick, and Max trotted beside him, tail wagging faintly. Neighbors who drove past would slow down and wave, smiling at the sight. A few recognized the dog from the local news years ago, whispering, "That's the police dog, isn't it? The one from the explosion." But Henry never boasted or explained. He simply nodded and kept walking. He wasn't saving a famous dog. He was helping a friend heal. In those quiet months, Henry began to heal too. For years, he had lived alone in that cabin, carrying the invisible weight of memories he never spoke about. He had once been a medic in the army, a man who had seen too much loss, too many faces fade away under his hands. He had buried his pain in silence, isolating himself from the world. But Max brought a kind of life back into the place. The sound of his paws on the porch, his soft breathing at night, the small spark in his eyes when Henry called his name, these things filled the emptiness that words never could. By the time spring rolled in, Max had changed. His coat gleamed again, his eyes were brighter, and though he still limped, his spirit no longer looked broken. He began to bark playfully when Henry picked up his leash and would even bring him an old tennis ball he found under the porch, nudging it toward his feet. The first time Henry threw it, Max limped after it, picked it up, and dropped it back proudly, his tail wagging. Henry laughed for the first time in years. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and lavender, Henry sat on the porch, sipping his tea, while Max rested beside him with his head on his lap. "You've come a long way, partner," Henry said softly, looking at the horizon. "Yes, we both have," Max responded with a low, contented sigh. For the first time in a long time, the old soldier and the wounded dog sat in peace, their scars no longer a symbol of pain, but proof that healing, though slow, was possible. Summer arrived gently that year, painting the countryside in bright greens and warm sunlight that lingered longer each evening. The days in Henry's small cabin settled into a rhythm that felt almost like music, soft, steady, and healing. Max followed Henry everywhere now. He no longer hid in corners or flinched at sudden noises. He would wake before sunrise, waiting patiently by the door until Henry appeared with his cup of coffee, and together they would walk through the open meadow behind the cabin. Birds sang, the air smelled like wildflowers, and the world seemed far away from everything that had once hurt them both. Henry often talked during those walks, not expecting answers, just sharing thoughts the way one might talk to an old friend. Max listened, head tilted, eyes calm. "Funny thing, life," Henry would say, tapping his walking stick against the dirt path. "It breaks you in all the places you least expect, and then somehow, it teaches you to stand again. Takes time though, always takes time." By midsummer, Max had become something of a local sight. Children from nearby farms would wave when they saw him walking with Henry. Shopkeepers in town would leave scraps of meat for him behind the counter. Some of the older townsfolk, remembering the story of the injured police dog from the news years ago, would stop to pet him gently. "You're lucky, boy," one old man said with a smile as Max wagged his tail softly. "You found the right human." Henry would just nod and chuckle. He never told anyone much about himself, and though people liked him, they knew little beyond the fact that he was a quiet carpenter who lived alone with his dog. One warm afternoon, Henry was sanding a chair on his porch while Max dozed nearby when a police cruiser pulled up the dirt road. The tires crunched against the gravel, and Max's ears perked up immediately. The car door opened, and out stepped Officer Jack Daniels, the same man who had once been Max's handler. His face was older, a little heavier, but his eyes still carried that unmistakable spark of affection when he saw Max. "I'll be damned," Jack whispered, walking closer. Max froze for a second, then stood up, tail slowly wagging as recognition spread through him like lightning. The old bond between man and dog reawakened in an instant. Jack knelt down, arms open, and Max limped forward, pressing his head against the man's chest with a low whimper. It was a reunion of two soldiers who had fought the same war and somehow survived. Henry watched quietly from the porch, his hands resting on the chair he was building. Jack looked up and smiled. "You must be Henry," he said. "I heard someone adopted Max after the auction. Didn't think I'd find him here looking this good." Henry nodded modestly. "He's a tough one," he said softly. "Just needed time and a bit of patience." Jack rose to his feet and studied the man in front of him. There was something familiar in Henry's calmness, the kind of steadiness that comes from someone who's seen a lot of pain and learned to live with it. After a few minutes of casual conversation, Jack asked the question that had been lingering in his mind. "You knew what you were getting into, didn't you? Taking in a dog like him most folks wouldn't." Henry hesitated before answering. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I knew." He looked away toward the meadow, his voice dropping lower. "He reminded me of someone." Jack was curious, but he didn't push. They sat on the porch for a while, talking about Max's recovery, the police department, and old stories of K9 units. Max lay between them, content, his head resting on Henry's boot. The conversation turned nostalgic, filled with laughter and shared admiration for the courage of dogs like Max, but beneath that lightness, something about Henry's tone carried a deeper shadow, a silence that hinted at more than he said. When Jack finally prepared to leave, he reached out his hand and said, "You saved him, you know." Henry shook his head gently. "No," he replied. "He saved me." Jack didn't understand at first, but he could see in Henry's eyes that those words weren't just sentiment, they were truth. That night, long after Jack had gone, Henry sat on the porch watching the fireflies dance in the tall grass. The air was still, and Max lay beside him, resting his head on Henry's lap. The old memories Henry had buried for years began to stir again. He thought about the war, the noise, the chaos, the smell of smoke that never really left his nose. He remembered being a young army medic in Afghanistan, crouching beside his own K9 partner, Rex, after an explosion had torn through their convoy. Rex had been hit badly, but even as Henry tried to save him, the dog had licked his hand, refusing to cry. Rex died that day, and Henry had carried that pain home with him, unable to speak of it, unable to forgive himself. That loss had followed him like a shadow, haunting every quiet night, every empty morning. When Henry saw Max at that police auction limping, scarred, and unwanted, he had felt something deep break open inside him. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. He saw the same silent suffering in Max that he had seen in the mirror for years. He saw the same courage to survive even when everything else was gone. Taking Max home wasn't just an act of kindness, it was Henry's way of making peace with his past. A second chance to save what he couldn't save before. As the night deepened, Henry reached down and rubbed Max's head gently. "You and I," he whispered, "we've both seen too much, haven't we?" Max stirred slightly and looked up at him, eyes calm and knowing. The cicadas sang in the distance, the stars blinked lazily overhead, and for the first time in years, Henry felt the heaviness in his chest begin to fade. Over the following weeks, Henry started telling small pieces of his story to the people who stopped by his workshop to buy furniture. It wasn't something he planned. Sometimes words just slipped out while sanding wood or carving joints. People would listen quietly as he spoke about his service, about Rex, about loss. They never interrupted, and when he finished, there was always silence, the kind that carried understanding instead of pity. Henry never said it out loud, but he knew that healing wasn't just about forgetting, it was about sharing the pain so it could finally breathe. By the end of summer, Henry and Max had become inseparable. The townspeople began calling them the two veterans. The one had fought with a rifle and the other with teeth and courage. Children would run past the cabin shouting greetings, and Henry, who once lived in complete solitude, found himself smiling more than he ever had before. The bond between man and dog had become something sacred, something built from shared wounds that turned into quiet strength. Henry often looked at Max and thought how strange life was, that redemption sometimes comes not from people, but from the loyalty of a creature who asks for nothing but love in return. That autumn, when the leaves began to turn red and gold, Henry hung a small tag on Max's collar. It wasn't the police badge he once wore, but a hand-carved, wooden pendant with a single word burned into it. Rex. It wasn't meant to replace the dog he had lost, it was meant to honor both of them. As he fastened it, Henry whispered, "For the one who stayed and the one who couldn't." Max wagged his tail, and in that small motion, Henry felt a kind of peace he had never known before. The man who once lived in silence had found his voice again, not through words, but through the quiet companionship of a dog who understood everything without ever having to speak. Autumn had arrived in the countryside like a quiet painting, splashing gold and amber across the trees that lined the fields around Henry's cabin. The air had grown cooler, crisp enough to make the mornings feel alive, and each sunrise brought a soft mist that hugged the hills. Henry loved this time of year. He would step outside with a mug of steaming coffee, breathe in the smell of wet grass, and watch Max trot slowly along the edge of the meadow. The old dog had grown stronger since summer. His limp was still there, but his spirit had returned completely. He barked now when Henry laughed, wagged his tail when children called his name, and carried himself with the calm confidence of a soldier who had earned his rest. Every person in the nearby town knew Max by sight. To the children, he was the brave dog who saved people once. To the grown-ups, he was a symbol of loyalty and second chances. Henry's life had also changed in quiet but meaningful ways. He had begun taking small furniture orders from local families, building tables, shelves, and wooden toys in his workshop. People liked visiting his cabin now. There was always the smell of fresh pine, the sound of soft country music playing on an old radio, and Max lying near the door with his head on his paws, watching everything with half-closed eyes. Evenings were calm. Henry would sit on the porch, his dog beside him, watching the sun dip behind the trees while the crickets sang in the tall grass. It was a simple life, but for Henry, simplicity was peace. Then one afternoon in late October, that peace was shaken in a way neither Henry nor Max could have imagined. The day had started beautifully, a sky clear as glass, the air crisp and full of life. Henry had gone into town to deliver a small rocking chair he'd made for a local family, while Max waited at home, resting near the porch steps. Around noon, shouts and sirens began echoing from the main road. Henry, who was chatting with the shopkeeper, stepped outside and saw a few police cars racing past. People gathered on sidewalks, whispering and whirring. A little girl from one of the nearby farms, only 6 years old, had gone missing while playing in the woods behind her family's house. The police and volunteers were already combing the area, but the forest stretched for miles, filled with dense undergrowth and uneven terrain. As hours passed and the sun began to lower, panic spread through the town like a cold wind. When Henry heard the news, something inside him stirred, that old instinct, that rush of adrenaline he hadn't felt since his days as a medic. He immediately thought of Max. Though his dog was older and injured, his nose was still sharp, his training buried deep within him like a sleeping flame waiting to rise again. Henry drove home quickly, and as soon as he pulled up to the cabin, Max ran to him, sensing his urgency. Henry knelt down, looking into those intelligent amber eyes that had once faced fire and fear without flinching. "We're needed, buddy," he said softly. One more time, Max's ears twitched, his tail lifted, and even though he was 7 years old and carried the weight of scars, something inside him lit up. He understood. Moments later, Henry and Max were driving toward the woods. When they arrived, dozens of people were already there, officers, volunteers, and family members calling out the child's name. The girl's mother was crying near the patrol car, clutching a small doll. Henry approached one of the officers, explaining who Max was and what he could do. At first, they hesitated. After all, Max was retired, injured, and clearly older. But the desperation in the mother's eyes broke through the doubt. "Let him try," she begged. The officer nodded, and Henry took the small sweater the child had been wearing earlier that morning, letting Max sniff it carefully. The old dog's nose twitched as he inhaled the familiar scent. His ears lifted, and his body went still. For a moment, the crowd seemed to hold its breath. Then Max began moving, slowly at first, then with purpose, his tail stiff, his nose low to the ground. Henry followed close behind, his heart pounding. The forest was thick, the sunlight fading into golden slants that pierced through the trees. The ground was uneven, covered in fallen leaves and the faint scent of rain. Max moved steadily, ignoring the pain in his leg, his instincts taking over completely. Every few minutes, he would pause, sniff the air, and change direction. Henry called out encouragement softly. "Good boy, Max. Keep going." Deeper and deeper they went, past a creek, over small mounds of earth, until suddenly Max stopped. His ears perked sharply, and a low bark rumbled in his chest. Then he took off, limping but determined, toward a cluster of old trees near the edge of a ravine. Henry stumbled after him, shouting for the officers to follow. When they reached the spot, Max was already digging near a hollow log, barking furiously. Henry dropped to his knees, pushing aside leaves and branches, and there she was, the missing girl, curled up and shivering, but alive. Her face was streaked with tears, her small hands clutching her doll tightly. She had wandered off, slipped on a slope, and become too frightened to find her way back. Henry scooped her up carefully, wrapping his jacket around her as Max licked her cheek gently, whining softly as if to say, "You're safe now." When the rescue team arrived moments later, the crowd that had gathered erupted into applause and tears. The mother ran forward, falling to her knees and hugging both her daughter and the old dog that had saved her. "Thank you," she cried, her voice trembling. "Thank you, you beautiful hero." That evening, as the sun disappeared and lights from police cars flashed against the trees, everyone wanted to meet the dog who had done the impossible. Cameras flashed, reporters took notes, and someone even called him the hero of Brookdale again. Henry stood nearby, one hand resting proudly on Max's back. The chief of police approached and said, "We should have never forgotten what he could do. Once a hero, always a hero." Henry smiled faintly and replied, he just needed someone to believe in him again. When they returned home that night, the cabin was silent except for the crackling of the fireplace. Max lay on his blanket, his body tired but his eyes shining brighter than ever. Henry sat beside him, brushing his fur gently. "You did it again, partner," he whispered. "You saved another life." Max looked up, wagging his tail slowly, and rested his head on Henry's lap. Outside, the wind carried the faint echoes of the town still talking about the old dog who had found the missing child. But inside the small cabin, there were no words, only the kind of silence that speaks of pride, love, and gratitude. As Henry looked into the firelight, he realized something he hadn't before. Heroes never truly fade. Sometimes they grow quiet, sometimes they limp, sometimes the world forgets them for a while. But when the moment comes, their courage always returns. And that night, as the flames danced in the hearth and Max slept peacefully beside him, Henry whispered the words that would stay with him forever. Once a soldier, always a soldier. Once a hero, always a hero. Winter crept slowly into the countryside, wrapping the hills and meadows in a soft white blanket that sparkled beneath the pale morning sun. The air carried a quiet chill, the kind that makes every breath visible, and Henry's small cabin stood like a warm island in a sea of frost. Inside, the fireplace glowed gently, filling the room with the scent of burning wood and comfort. On the rug near the fire lay Max, curled up peacefully, his gray-tipped fur rising and falling with each calm breath. His eyes were closed, but his tail thumped occasionally against the floor, as though he were still chasing dreams across the open fields. Since the day he had found the missing girl, life had changed for both Henry and Max. The story of the old police dog's heroic rescue had spread far beyond their little town. Newspapers printed his picture, showing him with his medal and that proud, scarred face that carried both wisdom and courage. Reporters came from neighboring cities to speak with Henry, asking him about Max's past, about the bond they shared, about what made this old dog still risk everything to save someone. Henry always answered with the same quiet honesty. Heroes don't ask if they can still fight, they just do what's right when the moment comes. His words struck something deep in people's hearts, and soon, Max became a symbol of hope, a reminder that brokenness doesn't end a story, it gives it meaning. The local police department, humbled and moved, decided to hold a ceremony in Max's honor. They wanted to give him an official medal of bravery for his second act of heroism. Henry didn't care much for public attention, but he agreed for Max's sake. On the day of the ceremony, the town square filled with people, children waving small flags, officers in uniform, families standing with pride. Henry stood at the center, with Max beside him, the dog's leash hanging loosely as though it was more a gesture of respect than control. The chief of police stepped forward, holding a small velvet box. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke. There was a time when this department forgot the value of loyalty and courage that cannot be measured by strength alone. Today, we honor one who reminded us that true heroes never retire. He bent down and pinned the new medal on Max's collar, just above the old one that had been awarded years before. The crowd erupted into applause. Some people cried. Henry's eyes shone with quiet pride as he rested his hand on Max's head. For a moment, everything felt complete to soldiers standing in peace, surrounded by the world they had both protected in their own ways. After the ceremony, Henry and Max returned home. The drive back was quiet, filled only with the hum of the old truck and the soft snoring of the dog beside him. The sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the sky in soft golds and pinks, and Henry smiled faintly. "Guess you showed them all, partner," he murmured. "You reminded them what real courage looks like." When they reached the cabin, Henry hung the new medal on a small wooden plaque above the fireplace. Beneath it, he carved a few words into the wood with his knife, "For those who never stop fighting, even when the world thinks they can't." He stepped back to look at it, then turned to Max, who sat watching him from the floor, tail wagging gently. "That one's for you," he said. As the days passed, winter deepened, and the world outside turned quiet. The fields slept under snow, and the river behind the cabin froze in stillness. Henry spent his days carving wood, fixing small things for neighbors, and keeping the fire alive. Max stayed close, sometimes sitting by the window, sometimes dozing near Henry's feet while the tools clinked softly in the workshop. He had grown slower, his steps heavier, but there was a peace about him now, as though he finally knew he was home for good. Every morning, Henry still spoke to him the same way he had since the beginning. "Come on, partner," he would say. "Let's take a walk." And every morning, Max would rise, stretch, and follow him out into the pale light of dawn. Then, one morning, the air felt different. The sky was clear, the world quiet, and the frost glittered like tiny diamonds on the ground. Henry stepped outside and looked around, realizing how still everything was. Max was lying on his blanket near the fire, his head resting gently on his paws, eyes half open as if he had been waiting for Henry to notice him. Henry knelt beside him, stroking his fur softly. "Morning, boy," he whispered, but Max didn't move this time. His breathing was slow, steady, but faint. His eyes lifted toward Henry, filled with the same calm understanding they had always carried. Henry felt his chest tighten. "Hey," he murmured, forcing a smile. "You're just tired." "Huh? It's okay. We'll rest a bit more today." But deep down, he knew. He could feel it, the quietness that comes before goodbye. He sat there with Max for hours, the fire crackling softly, his hand never leaving the dog's head. Memories flooded through him. The first day he saw Max at the auction, the way his hand had brushed against that trembling paw. Their first walk in the meadow, the night Max had saved that little girl, the medal ceremony, and all the silent mornings in between. Max had given him something no person ever had: unconditional loyalty, forgiveness without words, and a reason to believe that broken hearts could heal. As the afternoon light faded into golden dusk, Max exhaled softly and rested his head fully against Henry's hand. It was as if he were saying, "I'm home now." His eyes closed, and his breathing slowed until it was no more. Henry sat perfectly still, tears sliding down his face, his other hand trembling as he whispered, "You did good, soldier. You can rest now." The days that followed felt heavy, as though the air itself had forgotten how to move. Henry buried Max beneath the old oak tree behind the cabin, the same spot where they used to sit watching the sunset together. He carved a simple wooden marker that read, "Sergeant Max, a true hero, forever loyal." Beneath it, he placed Max's collar and the old medal from his police days. The new one stayed on the mantel, shining softly in the firelight. Every evening after that, Henry would sit on the porch with his cup of tea, watching the sky darken. Sometimes he would talk quietly, as if Max were still there beside him. "You know," he'd say, smiling faintly, "you didn't just save that little girl. You saved me too." In the spring that followed, the oak tree bloomed brighter than ever before, its branches heavy with fresh green leaves. Birds nested in its shade, and wildflowers grew thick around its roots. Travelers passing by the old cabin often stopped to read the small wooden marker and left flowers there. The story of the wounded police dog and the quiet stranger who saved him became a kind of legend in Brookdale, told in schools, shared at town gatherings, remembered with warmth and pride. Henry grew older, but he never felt alone again. On quiet mornings, he would still walk through the meadow, his footsteps steady, and sometimes, when the breeze blew softly through the grass, he swore he could hear the faint sound of paws beside him and the familiar thump of a tail brushing against his leg. He never looked for the sound. He didn't need to. He knew it was Max, walking with him, just as he always had, and so, in that quiet corner of the world, beneath the golden hills and the endless sky, lived the memory of a bond that had outlasted pain, duty, and time itself, a bond between a man who needed healing and a dog who taught him that love, once given freely, never truly dies. It only changes shape, finding new ways to stay, whispering through the wind, living forever in the heart that remembers.